Hey everybody, welcome back to Practical Alchemy's beginner tutorial to Fusion 360 Part 2. So we're going to continue modeling our construction brick, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you some additional sketching tools that you're going to need, specifically showing you how to reference existing sketch geometry to create new sketches. Then we're going to be talking about cut extrudes and some additional extrusion options. So now that we've got our brick, and if you missed tutorial part 1, you can click up here and check that out first if you don't know what we're doing. But we need to start building out the insides of our brick. So talking about this type of modeling, right? When you're doing 3D construction geometry like this, you can think about it in terms of additive and subtractive geometry. So far, when we did our first extrude, we created geometry, and then the pegs were joined to that. So we added additional geometry to it, almost like building with construction bricks. But you can also do subtractive geometry, very much like modeling with clay, where you're cutting things away, or carving a pumpkin is a good example, where you're actually carving things out of existing shapes. So here's what we're going to do. We need to first cut out the big part of this block. All right, so we are going to create a new sketch, and we actually have two options here. We could either sketch on the XZ plane, or we could select the bottom surface of this construction brick. I'm going to go with the bottom surface of the construction brick because while we do have the XZ plane, which is pretty much always going to be our ground plane, I wanted to always reference this bottom geometry. So I'm going to select that, and as you can see, it's going to snap us into position. Now, once we're here, we could go back and we could redraw the rectangle, we could redimension the rectangle, all of that, but we already have the rectangle's outer edge that we can use as a reference point. So what I'm going to show you here is what we call a sketch tool called projection. Okay, so if you click on the Create menu up here, you'll see some options for project. You can also use the hotkey, but I really like to do the drop-down menus, especially when I'm doing tutorials, so it shows you where the tools are in case you don't know the hotkeys. So we're going to click on project, and it is going to ask me the geometry that I would like to project into this sketch plane. There's a lot of different things that I can choose. I can actually choose faces, or I can choose edges. I'm actually just going to click here, and that is going to select that face. All right, and then I'm going to hit OK. And it doesn't really look like much has happened other than you can now see a faint purple line. But if I go over here to the browser on the left side, open up the bodies folder and hide the 3x2 brick that I created in part 1, you can now see that there are some purple geometry lines that are the exact same dimensions as that 3x2 brick. You can also see that when I hover over them, this little icon appears, and that is an additional constraint calling it out as projected geometry. So you can tell if something's projected geometry, one, by the pop-up constraint, and also by the color purple. Now, I am not actually going to be using these lines to create anything, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select all of them, and then over here in my sketch palette, I'm going to turn those into construction lines, because they're just there as a reference. I'm never going to use them for construction, although I could I'm never going to use them for projected geometry. I can change them back if I ever need to, but for right now, I just want to have them as construction. The next thing that I'm going to show you is a modifier command called the offset tool. The offset tool does exactly what it says. You copy selected curves and offset them from the original curve by a specific distance. So when I click on this tool, it's going to bring up the menu for me to select curves. I'm going to select this curve, and you can see that while I only selected one, it selected all 4 because this chain selection toggle is clicked on. So it's going to select all connected chains. And then you can see that I have now this pillbox slider, which I can push and pull to offset to a specific distance. So let's just say, for the sake of this geometry, I want this to be a 3mm wall. Well, you can see that there's a little bit of a problem if I toggle my body back on, which is now this line is outside, which I actually want it to be inside because I want to show the wall thickness. So no worries, I can just double click on that, change it to a -3, hit enter. Now you can see that it is offset by 3mm. So that's really great. And now what I can do is, you can see there everything in this sketch is black, which means it's fully constrained. and I can hit Finish Sketch and go back to the three-dimensional view and turn my geometry back on. And now I'm going to perform an extruded cut. Okay, so same as before, I'm going to just click on Extrude, and then it's already pre-selected this profile because it's the last thing that I selected. And now what I want to draw your attention to is, and I'm actually going to Shift and middle mouse click to turn it to the side. I'm going to click on the right plane just so you can see it from the side view. I could drag this out and create some additional geometry going downwards. All right. And you can see by default, the operation here is to join it or do an additive geometry. But if I open this up, I can click on cut, and you can see it now. It's going to turn it to a cut. The extrude direction is pointing downward, so it's showing me this error message, which is saying there's no boundary to cut. But that's really easy. If I just click and drag it in the opposite direction, now you can see that it is going to, I'm going to hold down the Shift and middle mouse button to change the viewport here. You can see that it is now cutting into this geometry. Now I could just set it at a specific distance. I could think back to my model and say, well, I made this 20 millimeters thick and I wanted the wall thickness to be 3, so it's going to be 17. But what I can also do, I'm going to rotate again just so you can see the top view, is in this extension type, the default is going to be distance. But if I click on this, I can say up to an object. All right, and now it's going to ask me which object I want to extend up to. So rather than giving it a set distance, I give it a face or a point that I want it to essentially intersect with. In this case, I'm going to select this top face. And you can see that, well, that's kind of what I want. I do want it to reference this top face, but I don't want it to go all the way up here because now it's going to cut out all the way up here. I'm going to hit OK just to show you what happens then. Not only did it cut all the way through this top surface, but it also created 6 new bodies because there is nothing here, there's no material here that allows me to join the pegs to the brick. But because this is a parametric model and we're modeling non-destructively, no worries, we can go back and edit this feature. And in the extend type, I can add an offset. So I don't want it to go all the way up to this face. I want it to be offset from this face by a set distance. In this case, I want it to be -3. All right. And now when I hit enter, Shift and middle mouse button to rotate, you can see that we now have an offset. Here is what I want you guys to understand when we're talking about the offset command. The reason that I used reference geometry in the sketch and then also a reference plane here is that it allows me to make changes to things further up in the model tree or the model timeline. I guess in Fusion it's more of a timeline than a tree. If I go back to my original sketch and I'm going to right click on the original sketch, hit edit sketch, and let's just say I wanted to make this twice as wide. I want this to be 100. Hit enter. And now finish this sketch. You can see that this has really messed up the pegs because they were modeled with some very strict dimensional guidelines. But when I flip this over, you can see that it is still a consistent 3 millimeter wall thickness all the way around because I have referenced this edge in my sketch here. This edge was referenced, and so it's always going to offset from this edge no matter how this edge is defined in terms of its actual dimension. I'm going to hit Finish Sketch. Now I'm actually going to hit Control-Z again, Control-Z again, and Control-Z again until I get back to my original dimension of 50, finish the sketch, and you can see it is now snapped back. I can do the same thing in terms of the extrusion. So let's say I take that main body, and instead of it being 20 millimeters thick, I actually want it to be 50 millimeters thick, not 500. In this case, again, you can see, it's actually a little bit harder to see. I'm going to hit the right plane icon up here in the top right, and down in the bottom view, I'm going to click on this display settings icon. In the visual style, I'm going to change from shaded with visible edges only to hidden edges. So now you can see all the edges that are not necessarily visible. It's essentially an X-ray view. Hidden edges are shown with dotted lines. But again, you can see I've still maintained that 3 millimeter wall because I'm not referencing a specific dimension. I'm referencing an offset from this face. So wherever this face goes, that extruded cut will always go up to it. Now I'm going to hit Control Z to go back to my original dimensions. And I think we're at a really good point. In the display view, I'm going to go back down here, switch the visual style back to shaded with visible edges only, so we don't have so much to look at, and I think we are in a really good spot. All right, now to really bake this in, we are going to repeat the same process with the pegs. So I'm going to create a new sketch, and in terms of the position of this sketch, I'm going to select this interior surface, and now I need to essentially project and offset those pegs. So what I'm going to do, click on Create, Project. I can't see those pegs right now, so I might want to switch my visual style to either hidden edges or wireframe, just so I can see those. It's still kind of hard to select them through. So I can actually leave this sketch view, this flat orthographic view. So hold down the Shift key and middle mouse click to rotate, and then I can select either the faces or the edge, and then I can actually select whatever. I'm doing this on purpose. Normally I would select the same thing all the way just for consistency and hit OK. And as you can see, if I go back to my bottom view, which I can hit by clicking here, and now I'm going to turn this body off so that it's not so visually oppressive. You can see I now have 6 purple circles. All right. With those purple circles, I'm going to Shift-click and select them all, turn them into construction geometry, and now I'm going to offset them. All right, pull and do -3. Now, click offset again, -3. This is very tedious, you may be saying, as we just to start this. And it is very tedious, and I'm doing it this way on purpose because I want to, in the next tool, show you a better way to do this. Because I specifically want to call out the fact that this is a tedious method, and going back to some of those geometry constraints that we used versus dimensional constraints that we talked about in the last video, I'm going to show you how you can do that faster. Okay, let's go ahead and turn the body back on. All right, I'm going to Shift middle mouse click to change my view, and now I'm going to finish my sketch, hit Extrude, change the operation type to Cut, and it actually has not selected those profiles, so I need to go in and select all 6 profiles. Then I'm going to change my extend type to Object, and then I'm going to select the plane that I want to extrude up to. And as you can see now, we've got some through cuts, so we want to change this to an offset of -3. And I'm going to change my display type back to shaded with visible edges only. You can see that I have a hollowed out construction brick with a 3 millimeter wall thickness throughout. Very good. Next thing that I want to show you is how to create the internals, ribs of this brick. So let's go ahead and create another sketch. We are going to sketch on this plane again. All right, and now here's where I want to show you what I mean by creating a simpler geometry-based relationships when we are modeling these ribs. So to do this, if we look at the inside of a construction brick, there's going to be a circle here that touches 4 pegs. And then there's going to be some additional ribs and bossing inside. So it's some additional support arms made out of plastic. So let's go through that process again to call upon this geometry. So click on Create, Project, and I'm going to select 4 of these edges. Hit OK. Why only 4? Well, we only need 4 because we know that this is a middle line or a mirror line of our brick. So anything that we do over on this side in terms of creating geometry, we can simply mirror across a mirror line and not have to draw it and dimension it twice. Let's go ahead and create that mirror line now. Click on the line tool, snap to the origin, go out a certain distance, hit escape to close the tool, and now we are going to turn that into a center line. Okay, I'm going to turn the body off again just for a second. Now, we need to somehow get a circle into the center here. So how do we do that? Again, thinking about this in terms of the geometric relationships. Well, we know that the center of the diagonal is essentially going to be the center of this square. I'm going to click on that line to turn it into construction geometry. Click Create, Point, find the triangle to pop up to designate the center point constraint, and now we have that. Hit Escape. Now we can create a center point circle, which will sit here, and then I'm going to pull this up to a certain distance and hit Escape. Let's go ahead and change these to construction geometry just so that we don't get confused as we continue to develop. Click on construction, and you can see that this circle is blue because it's not constrained to anything. All right, I would like to constrain it to one of these circles. So all I have to do is hold down the Shift key, and I'm going to pull up a new constraint that we haven't used, which is the tangent constraint. That is essentially two circles that are touching along a tangent line. We can talk more about that in other tools, but that is going to be the tool that we use for now. Hit Escape, and I'm actually going to turn this to construction geometry as well. Why do we want to turn that to construction geometry? Well, whenever we're designing multiple parts that are going to fit together and we're potentially going to CNC or 3D print them, we want to include something called the manufacturing tolerance, which is a gap that allows the parts to fit together. If there's no gap, quite frankly, your parts are going to be so snug that you won't actually be able to get them together at all. That will make more sense as we continue. I promise. Okay, now we can go ahead and offset this by a certain distance. So click on the offset tool, click, and I'm going to pull this in. For my 3D printer, the offset for a interference fit is going to be 0.4 millimeters. I actually need to make that negative 0.4 millimeters and hit enter. It's going to be pretty small, but you can see that there is a slight offset from where this circle would be to those pegs. Now that circle is hollow. It does not allow me to create an offset off of an existing offset in Fusion 360. So what I'm going to have to do is create another center point circle. And this is actually great because now I can show you a different way of dimensioning. So when you dimension two circles that are coincident, it's going to do that. Actually, let's back up. This is a great opportunity to show you another constraint that we haven't used before. So instead of snapping to the center point of the previous circle, we can actually start over here. And if I select this circle and I select this circle, I have a new constraint option up here, which is concentric, which basically means that two circular or arc or ellipses will share the same center point. And in this case, that center point will be aligned with the diagonal's midpoint because of how I constrain the first circle. What I want you to take away from this is that there are multiple and oftentimes redundant ways to dimension things and get to a point where your sketch is fully constrained. And in some situations, the constraint that you use will matter in terms of being able to go back and parametrically edit your model later. And in some cases, there aren't. And as you continue to learn and grow, you will have a better sense of which constraint is appropriate given the context of the overall geometry. So the last thing that we need to do is add some dimensionality to this, because while the center point is now constrained using the coincident constraint, there's still some variability in this size. So I'm going to hit the sketch dimension command. All right, you can see by default it wants to do that, but if I select both circles, it will allow me to set the distance between them. In this case, that is still going to be 3. Hit escape, and we are looking pretty good. Okay, now there are some additional ribs that we have internally with a 3x2 construction brick. So what we want to do is essentially add a rectangle that goes off the side here. Now we don't know where it terminates because we need some additional geometry. So I'm going to turn this brick back on. I'm going to use the projection tool again, and I'm going to select this edge. All right, and I'm going to hit OK. Now you can see that this is going to reference the internal edge of the wall that we created in the last extruded cut. So turn the construction body back off just so we don't need to see it. I'm going to select all 4 of these and I'm going to turn them into construction geometry. All right, and now I want to create a rectangle that is centered along this surface. We are going to use the rectangle tool, but rather than using the corner points, this time underneath the feature options, we can actually select a center rectangle. So the first thing that it's going to want is the center point, which I am going to place here to be coincident with the other center points. And then I can drag that out until it is coincident with that outer wall. And hit escape to exit the command. And as you can see, we now have a rectangle. It is constrained in terms of the width because it is coincident with this outer edge, but it is not constrained from the height. All right, awesome. So let's go ahead and just use that same dimension. So we are going to click on these 2 verticals and horizontals, hit 3 millimeters and hit escape to exit the command. Okay. Now, we've done a lot of work. We've added a lot of geometry to this sketch. And as you can see, there's nothing over here. So let's go ahead and mirror everything that we've created. So let's go down to the mirror command, select the objects that we want to mirror, which are going to be all of these lines. And we are going to select our mirror line. Oh, it auto-calculated it because this is the only mirror line or center line in the sketch. So it went ahead and auto-selected it for us. We don't need to select any of this reference geometry because it really doesn't matter. We don't need to duplicate it. It would just be overkill. But as you can see now, we have both of these, which are really great. Okay, we are at a good place with this sketch. So we're going to hit Finish Sketch, all right? And now I want you to turn the body back on so that you can see it, all right? And now I want to show you 2 additional things. So we have way more sketch geometry here than we need, all right? And so what we actually wanted, but Fusion is pretty smart in that it will, anytime there are geometry lines or sketch lines that create a closed loop, it will show that that's an object. So when I go to create these ribs, I can actually go ahead and select each of those small profiles individually. And I didn't have to delete this, well, let's not say we don't have to delete it. We can just ignore, essentially, this middle bar here. And now I can extrude this up. In terms of operation, we do want to join it because it is going to be part of the same block. All right, and we are going to we don't want it to go all the way up. So we are going to use our extend type, and we are going to go up to the object, click here. We don't want to go all the way up, so we're going to go offset by 3 millimeters. And whoops, wrong direction. I overshot the face. So let's right click, edit feature, and we are going to go -3 millimeters. Okay, great. So this is pretty good. Now there's something interesting happening here that I want to point out to you, and this I promise will be the last thing that we cover in this video. I actually want the center of this circle to go all the way up to this edge. Not these side ribs here. I did want a little bit of an inset, but for this center circle, I actually do want this to go all the way up. So let's go over to our sketch panel here. All right, this is sketch 7. This was our internal ribs. And down on the timeline, I actually want you to scrub back before that last extrusion. That's going to suppress the last extrusion here, all right? Go up here to the sketches to turn that back on, and we are going to create another extrusion, all right? Let's click on extrude, and let's select this entire circle as part of this profile. Now, I'm going to change my extent type to object, and I'm going to offset all the way up to that surface. Hold down the shift key and rotate so that you can see that it goes all the way up, and hit enter. All right, great. And let's go ahead and turn that sketch back off so we can hide it. No, let's leave it on. I'm sorry. And go ahead to your timeline and now scrub forward to the last sketch. Okay, yes, we need to turn the sketch off. There's way too much going on visually. So what have we learned here? Well, we've learned two things. Number one, the same sketch can be used to reference multiple geometries, or in this case, multiple extrusions. So you can set up your file if things are going to share a cross-section so that you can use that cross-section in multiple places. You don't have to do a ton of projecting or a ton of redrawing geometry into different sketches. If you set your files up correctly, you can create a few master sketches and you can extrude multiple things at multiple depths off of them. The other thing that we've learned here is that this timeline is live and you can go back in time. So at any point, not only can you adjust the sketch by editing it, let's say I wanted to make this rib 5 millimeters, finish sketch. You can see now I have some thicker ribs, but I can also place things in the timeline before other things, all right? So I can actually, like we just did here, place this circle in the timeline ahead of the ribs that we had actually created first. But in terms of the timeline, they exist in that order. If I go back, you can see it is now hidden that last thing that I've done. We'll talk a lot more about this, but what I want you to understand is, yes, you can move things in space. I'm going to go back and edit this sketch back to 3 millimeters really quickly. Finish sketch. Yes, you can go back in time, but you can only reference things that already exist. So for example, I can't create this extrusion before I've created the sketch that it references, right? So you do have to have some dimensional dependencies in terms of your timeline, but you do not necessarily have to construct things in the right order or go back and delete them if you did things in the wrong order. All right, if they're not directly referencing each other, then no problem. You can change the way that things are ordered in your timeline. I know that was probably a lot to talk about in one tutorial, but hopefully it was explained in enough detail that it made sense. If it didn't make sense, no worries. We are going to be going through these things multiple times. Again, the point here is to show you my workflow, help you understand the workflow of this type of modeling so that you can pick it up. And over time, you will develop these habits, you'll develop these skills, and you'll be able to do it no problem. With that, I'm going to wrap up the video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. If you'd like to be notified as future videos are released, hit the subscribe button. There's going to be a lot of new content coming. If you had any questions or ideas for future topics you'd like me to cover, throw those down in the comments as well. With that, I would like to say thank you for joining me today, and I will see you in the next one.